Hello, it's Writing Wednesday, and I'm here in Davis, California. Come up to see Andrew's play, so doing this from the Airbnb house that he's rented. So this is a really pretty house. I like this a lot. So it's just a good place to work, and as usual, I'm at the kitchen table where I always end up working. And I am taking questions today, answering your writing questions. So feel free to throw them up there when you are inspired. If there's something that you want to ask, but there are questions that people have sent me this week, so I thought I would start with them. Hi. Here is a question that someone is struggling with a scene that they have written two different ways. Hey, they have written two different ways, one with two characters and one with three characters, and was asking me in general which I thought was better. She said there were different reasons that she chose, that she liked each scene, but that she couldn't make a decision. Now, in the absence of knowing, what she liked best about each scene, and if you're watching, feel free to jump in. When you can't figure out which scene works better, a 2 or a 3 person scene, you just ask yourself, why do you like each one? What is it that you like about it? And then what does each one lack that the other has? And so that can give you some basis. Are they the same two characters with the addition of a third? You ask yourself, what does the third person add? Does it add more conflict? Does it lead you to a stronger end of that scene? Or does it just make the scene longer and more complex? Also, take a look at what's around it. Have you had another 2-person scene in front of it? And then that's a 2-person scene, and the next one's a 2-person scene? You might want to use a 3-person scene to make sure that there's variety. So it's a question of asking yourself about the dynamics. What does that third person offer you that you weren't able to achieve in a 2-person scene? Otherwise, generally you go for the simpler one, unless there's a rhythmic reason. If you have too many 2-person scenes, definitely do the 3-person scene. All right, here's another question. How about a lesson on building complex characters? This is from Jo Beth. I love the people in your books, how they grow and change even as they struggle with their demons. Well, complex character means that they're multidimensional. So what makes for a flat character? Let's start with that. Secondary characters, third, walk-ons, usually just have one strong trait that makes them identifiable. The argumentative ice cream man, the sexy fruit dealer, whatever. But complex characters, the more central they are to the story, the more complex they should be. And if you have secondary characters who are unique, do have a couple or more than a couple of unique traits, it makes your world so much more vivid. I mean, it's true that not every donut fryer needs to be as complex as Hamlet. There's no point, and you will waste a lot of time making them a little bit too. But I always find specificity, there's never anything wrong with that. So in a 3D what we're talking about is dimensionality. What makes a complex character? Dimensionality, people who are divided within themselves, who struggle with internal contradictions, are complex characters. And a good protagonist, a good secondary character, major characters who struggle with parts of their personalities, that the situation puts pressure on. We talked about how story works. So story will put pressure on the contradictions that people have within them. Maybe part of a character wants to be independent, part of them wants to be taken care of, and that's an internal struggle. Most people aren't just one thing. They struggle against themselves as well as against other people. But we talked about, at some point, at some point we were talking about the three-dimensional character study, that usually you come in knowing certain things about your character and then you run out of what you know about them. And I suggested Lagos Egri's Art of Dramatic Writing, that they have a character study in there that is, when you run out of what you know about your characters, you can think about them a little bit more deeply. So the three dimensions of character would be physical, social, and psychological. So when we talk about physical, what does that mean for character? Well, what would you do if you went in for physical? You'd get height, weight, hair color, eye color, posture. Are they upright? Are they very vigorous? Do they have scoliosis? Are there, is their musculature well developed? Are they skinny? Are they wiry, sinewy? You can describe somebody and really kind of get a grip on their physicality. Their body type. Are they, what is their health history, their heredity, medical history? Were they ill as a child? All these go into building building a unique character. What are their gestures? Are there tics? Do they not move their arms when they walk as a certain kind of person? Then that's physical is also their clothing, their hygiene. Are they, do they need a shower? Do they not shave regularly? Do they shave badly? All these will really bring that character into focus. Their personal style, do they have any? Scars, birthmarks, physical abnormalities are things that you can bring into play with that character against their social dimension. So that's their family of origin, their current family, if any, their living situation, class, occupation, education, family dynamics, intelligence. What do they read? Do they read? Do they read anything? Do they read magazines? Do they read stuff on their phone? This is going to all be, you might think of it as background, that it might not have that much, but you'd be surprised what comes up when you start asking yourself these people. Personal style. Are they flamboyant? Are they a fashionista? Are they fond of putting plaids and stripes together? Are they like right out of J. Crew? Do they have little imagination? Do they like sand colors? Do they like bright colors? That's personal style. So when we're in social, types of reading, types of entertainment, it's interesting if you have like a quiet intellectual person who only likes action movies. A middle-aged professor who secretly goes to see action movies, and she's the only person over 21 in there, and it's all these teenage boys and her. That's interesting. their spiritual beliefs. That's a social level, a community. People don't think, does your character believe in God? Does your character believe in a higher power? Do they believe in the supernatural? Do they believe in ESP? You know, you start asking yourself these questions, your character, it unlocks your character, starts opening them up. You know, how do they socialize? Do they socialize? Are they somebody who does better on the, you know, they'd rather text people than talk to somebody? Then you get them on the phone and they're very awkward. That would be a wonderful character trait. What are their abilities? What are their languages? You know, a dainty lady who nevertheless can open jars, like pop, and there it goes. You know, people with unexpected abilities, people who have foreign language that you're really surprised that they have. What are their attitudes towards money? You know, I mean, people never write about things that are desperately important to everyone, which is like, how are you going to make a living? What is the attitude towards money? Super interesting. Do they still have the first dollar they got, you know, for their bar mitzvah? Do they still have it? Or, you know, are they somebody, you know, money comes in and money goes out and they don't even notice, or they don't notice that they're spending, you know, $4 on a head of broccoli instead of 2. They don't even know what things should cost. It's very interesting. So you have the physical level, you have the social level. You know, physical, somebody's on a diet. Totally different person than somebody who lets themselves have cream puffs, you know, as you're writing them. Then you have the psychological level. So social is what's on the exterior of the person, behavior. Then the psychological level of the 3D, the third dimension, is their values. What are their values? Sometimes their values even might clash with what they're actually doing. Makes it super interesting, that contradiction inside the character. Are they ambitious? What is their ambition in life? You know, sources of pride, the things they're proud of, the things, you know, that they're ashamed of. What is their biggest frustration in life? Their attitudes towards life, their sexual history. Did they, you know, lose their virginity at 23 or at 13? Very different. And people can have a different reaction to that. Who are they attracted to? Do they allow themselves to show their attraction? Or are they ashamed of even being attracted to people? You know, you're going to get a lot of complexity out of this. What are their phobias? What are their complexes? What are their neuroses? You know, somebody who can't stand insects in the house. You have a conversation with them and they can't stop looking at that moth on the windowsill. Phobias are fabulous. You know, just to write all the phobias you can think of. A friend did that for me. Made a whole book of phobias that many of them made up, which is the most interesting. Superstitions, that's another really good thing to do an exercise, and think of all the things you can be superstitious about, both things that are cultural to your culture, to other people's cultures, and then things that are uniquely yours. I'm writing a short story about somebody who had her world had been ruined by somebody who was a cigar smoker. So now every time she smells cigar, she's on edge. What are their neuroses? How imaginative are they? Some people are incredibly imaginative, and when they're worrying, they can really just worry all out of proportion. And then some people just don't go there. They don't have much of imagination. You know, you can warn them certain things are likely to happen, and they just don't see it until it actually happens. They can't even picture it. So ask yourself that. What's their level of imagination? What's their temperament? Are they slow to anger? Are they a hair trigger anger? Are they warrior? Are they kind of sunny personality? they take things in stride? Are they the four humors? If you think of the Middle Ages, the four humors, the choleric, which are the kind of, they get angry easy, they're the go-getters, they're, out in front of the pack, making things happen. There's the sanguine personality, which is sunny, happy, things are going great. There's the melancholic, where anything goes wrong, the whole world is going to come to an end. They can be, the sanguine, and then the phlegmatic, which is the laid back, and they like to have something to eat. So you always have food in your stories for the phlegmatic, because they want to read about food. So if you think of these three categories, and you think of your characters in terms of the three, the physical, the social, and the psychological, as intersections between these, layers of these, you can get far more information about your character, and you will naturally be building a more complex character. So let's see what kind of questions we have coming in. I know Kevin says, I know you don't have a writing MFA. How do you teach yourself to write and analyze literature? I tear it apart. I read something, I take that paragraph that I admire. Sometimes I'll write a paragraph based on that paragraph, using my own language, but using their level of diction, their syntax, and seeing what it's like to write in the style of Henry James, or noticing by pulling apart Poe and seeing how Poe structures a sentence to get that heightened, nervous, and why would you call me nervous? There's a lot of repetition. There's a lot of what I call the hesitation waltz, where he holds you off the end of a sentence by flinging in dependent clauses. So you tear open people's work. If you dare diagram a sentence, or even try, take somebody that you admire and really look at their structure. So that's how you learn, by analyzing literature. You can also do annotations, which is like a writing journal or a reader's journal, where instead of talking about who the protagonist is and what happens in the plot and stuff, ask yourself, how is this affecting my writing? What are they doing that is really interesting? And you might find yourself reading things that are more interesting, that have more potential to be understood, that aren't just kind of middle brow writing the way everybody writes, but are writers who are doing something interesting. That is a really good way to teach yourself to analyze literature. And I talk to my books. I write in the margins. If they're doing something interesting, it's like, wow, look at that, underline stuff. And then go back and analyze it and try to write something using that syntax. Describe what they're doing. See if you can bring that up into consciousness rather than just reading it and going over. I'm looking at your questions. Here's Linda. It seems to me as a new writer, character creation is revealing of the person, of you as a writer. I don't want to. How do I get out of my own head to create someone besides myself or my opposite? Every writer is different, and you bring your own peculiarities, your own psychological peculiarities to your work. So if you're somebody who has a hard time apprehending other people in their wholeness, that a constructed character is not as easy for you as yourself, or the opposite of yourself. What I think of is, think of a dream. In a dream, everyone is you. Everyone is a piece of you. So what you can do is you can take aspects of your personality and divide them up and give them to different people in the story. So one person can be all of your aggression. One person can be all of your vulnerability. One person can be all of your, your greed or your anxiety. And then you let them play off of each other. So in that way, you can write about yourself, but not, these characters then start to become their own people. And they start to separate from you. It's like cell division almost, that, and then it breaks free and becomes its own person. But everybody puts a lot of themselves into their own characters. It seems like writing is like acting. Melanie says, yes. It is so wonderful if you read about what actors do to create character. Writers can use this. All those exercises are wonderful for actors. For writers, because it's exactly creating a character the way actors do. A wonderful thing to do is to look up Brando talking about acting is so the way writers, that method acting, because they are losing themselves in that character. What they do is they think of something that's happened to them that will produce the emotion that occurs in their part, their acting part. So it's connecting the inside to the performance. Acting techniques are wonderful too, because they make you more aware of what people are doing physically. Your characters will move more, they will have intentions, all the things they need to do. So yes, it's very much like acting. Terrific question. And let's see what else we've got. Let's see. Have you ever done an engram with your characters? This is a system of 9 kind of personality. They're personality types and they're sort of destiny questions. The kind of life challenges that people with that kind of personality have to overcome. These systems, like the engram that Barbara is talking about, or that EF and J, I forgot what it's called. There's like 16 types. Some people do really well with that. It's just like the 3-dimensional character study. Is your character an introvert, an extrovert? Are they observant or are they judgmental? Are they, I forgot some of the other letters. And those are, systems, any one of them will be very helpful to create new Myers-Briggs, thank you. Any one of these will be wonderful to create things about your character that you didn't know. You usually start with a little spark of something, and then things add up. Here's another question. How can you tell if a short story is supposed to remain a short story or if it's worth turning into a novella? Do you ever write short stories yourself? I think this is such a great question, because I believe that it's a really fabulous thing to begin with short stories, because people who start to write a novels take so darn long. My average is 5 years. Now, I do not want to spend 5 years on something and have it fall apart in my hands in year 3 or 4 or 5. I want to know that there is something there. So I believe in writing short stories. I'm not a fabulous short story writer. I live with somebody who can just write short stories like bam, 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 and they're so good. I struggle with a short story, but I think of it as a laboratory for ideas. I'd rather spend 3 weeks playing with something and seeing if it has some energy to it, or if it's just, I can't even finish a short story. What if I had started the novel? What a nightmare. I think that a short story, when you finish it, you have a finished short story. And I found it's like there's more life there. There's more to it than just the short story. When I'm more attracted to it, I'm not done with it, I want to keep expanding it, then that has more pressure to become a novella or a novel. When you feel you're not done, when you've just gotten the beginning, or you've just gotten the end of the magician's handkerchief, and you just feel like, wow, 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 that could keep going. But I say write a bunch of short stories and then see which ones have that feeling that there's more energy, more power to it, rather than sitting down saying, I'm going to write a novel about so-and-so. It's like, might not want to. Let's see, what other questions here? Let's see. Do you use reference books for characters? I use that Art of Dramatic Writing. I use that three-dimensional character study when I run out of stuff. But generally, reference books, more for getting ideas. God, you're reading something and you go, God, that would make a really good short story. Or I'm really attracted to that character. So not so much, Okay, let me go back to the questions that people have asked me this week. Here's a question, really good one from Terry. Wanted to know, does having a 13-year-old protagonist mean the novel I'm writing is YA? So it's a genre question. The two other important characters are adults. So there's an uncle and a mother. All right, so what is the difference between a 13-year-old protagonist of a novel intended for adults and a novel intended for young adults? Either one of them can have a 13-year-old protagonist. I mean, White Oleander, for instance, has Astrid begins as a 13-year-old, but it is not a young adult novel. It has a young adult protagonist. I always think of the difference between young adult and adult fiction, literary fiction, is that the moral or ethical questions that are being dealt with have a lot more gray areas when we are looking at adult fiction. There's a lot of villains who may be villains and may not be villains. And they might change positions. The language is usually more complex. Characters are more complex. The good guys and the bad guys aren't as easily teased out. The young adult book is usually more streamlined around its themes, whereas an adult audience is more able to bear with some interesting digression and keep the central problem in mind. A young adult novel really generally sticks to the topic and cuts to the chase. So there's room for a lot more complexity in the adult novel. So it doesn't really matter. Also, the level of diction. In an adult novel, you generally don't want the prose to be in that child's voice or in that teenager's voice. That tends to be a young adult writing. if a protagonist's thoughts are capable of, a lot of subtlety, and their thoughts and language, you can use third person, so it can be an adult language looking through the eyes of this 13-year-old, but you're not necessarily going to be stuck in teenage language. That's more adult writing. If you're in that teenage prose, especially if you're in first person, if you're caught in a more simplified language, that's probably going to be tending to be young adult. Although young adult is certainly a wide open field at the moment, and is just getting more and more interesting as time goes on, and blurring. I mean, I'm finding that if I go into my local library, if I look in the young adult section, I will find the great literature is in the young adult section. So 100 Years of Solitude is no longer in literature, it's in young adult, because that's where teenagers are looking for their reading. So it's it's an interesting time. I'm not quite sure, but definitely the simplicity of the story, the more simplicity of language, less digression, and less moral gray areas in YA fiction. Here is a really nice set of questions. How much does Anais Nin and other authors influence your work? Which I love that. Anais Nin was, for me, one of the first women writers who really tried to write what she felt to be women's interior lives. She was very interested in the internal life of the human being, and that had a huge, huge, huge effect on me. She herself as a person, the woman artist that I saw in her, leading a very interesting, exciting life, that had a huge influence in me. But her writing as well, very poetic, very internal. That interested me, very psychological. How much slang should you use in young adult? Will it sound dated? That is a super question. That is a really good question. Slang will date it. Using brand names instead of just describing things will date it. To say it's their, and then he looked him up on his iPhone. Well, in 10 years, the iPhone will be dead. His Adidas, well, we don't care if they're Adidas. If you're writing for the moment, then these are signifiers of the moment. But if you're batting for the back fence, avoid the things that are going to become dated. So slang, how much slang, that's very interesting. I like slang if it's not tedious. I don't mind a teenager in 2015 calling somebody daddy-o, which is, of course, ironic because it's a 1950s term. I sometimes say groovy because it's a 1970s term, and it makes me laugh when I do it. So yeah, it's definitely, there's no hard and fast answer to this one, but definitely something to consider is how it dates your work. Let's see, here's another question from that list. How do you manage to describe sight, sound, smells, and action in such a beautiful and simple way? Thank you very much. Is it the way you think or see, or do you focus on making it that way? I do exercises. I keep notebooks. I go out and challenge myself to describe what that wind looks like, and then I keep it in my notebook. So when I go to write and I'm sitting in a room without windows, I can take these notebooks and remember what a day in late May in Sacramento was like, and the wind and the quality of the air and stuff like that. So you have to make time to do those exercises, to keep those notes, Keep them in notebooks, keep them handy so that you can use them. So no, it doesn't come naturally. Me, like everybody else, if I'm not writing, I'm not thinking about writing, if I'm not keeping my notebooks, I'm not doing this kind of observational work, I'm like everybody else. I'm rushing to, to meet somebody for lunch, and I got to pick up this, and I got to the dentist, and blah, 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 blah. But because I'm a writer, I see something, I will stop and take a note. I will think about it. I will take the time to observe. What inspires you? What inspires me? Oh, wow. The beauty of the world, the intricacy of the world, injustice, longing, loneliness, beauty. I don't get inspired if I stay home sucking my thumb. I will, reading something really beautiful, or formally, meaning in its form challenge, is, I find, really exciting. Reading definitely inspires me. Reading people who are super interesting and what they're doing on the page is really interesting, not just storytelling. That doesn't inspire me. The way somebody actively using the form in an interesting way, or having a really interesting view of the world, makes me want to jump up and go look, or jump up and write. And that's what those, keeping those annotations. What are you reading that makes you want to throw the book down and go to work? What did you think of the White Oleander movie? It's very flattering when someone wants to make a film based on your film. It's always interesting, and I thought that they did a super job. I was very happy with it. Which of your characters is your favorite? I have so many favorites, There's some, when you're working on something, a character you really connect to, or makes you laugh, or they're silly, or they're such unique people. Those are always the favorite characters. How do you bring the beauty of words strung together in sentences that's like music? How do you do that? You read poetry out loud, and then you read your own stuff out loud. You always read it out loud. You listen for the music. If you were performing this, is there a sound? Is there crunchiness in the consonants? Is there alliteration and assonance in the language? Reading poetry out loud is the way to do it, and then reading your own stuff out loud. And when it makes the music, you can hear it. And when it doesn't make the music, you can hear it and feel it in your own mouth. You can feel it. And then you'll rise and try to change that and make it more musical. Here's a question. Do you have favorite characters of your own whom you would consider villains? Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Always have my villains. In Marina M., I have a character who, Varvara, who is a very complex character, has a very complex relationship with the protagonist, but who is a villain. And the thing to know about villains, writing your villains, is that nobody is a villain to themselves. Everybody has a reason for what they do. And in writing a good villain, always make sure that you give the devil their due, that they have their reasons. Things have happened to them. They see things a certain way. And generally, they're not like, I'll get them. They're not. That's not what they're doing. They're usually like, you fucked me, or somebody else fucked me, and I'm going to get you. I can't, some people have to kick up, if a vulnerable person is there. I have a character in Marina M. Who works in an orphanage, No, it's the new one that's coming out, Chimes of a Lost Cathedral. Works in an orphanage and thinks that it's wrong to spoil the orphans because they're going to have a hard life. And if you soften them up, they're going to pay that much more. It's going to be that much harder. Does she feel like she's a villain? No. She feels like she's doing those kids a favor. So that's interesting. So writing a villain with depth, it's the same thing. You're using the three-dimensional character study. Where do they come from? What, they're physical, they're sociological, and they're psychological. You see who they are as a whole person, which is resulting in the behavior that you've created. Villains with depth, that's the name of the game. That's the difference between crap writing and real writing, is that your villains are complex people and have their own reasons for doing what they do. And if you respect that, the reader, it becomes a way of looking at the world and realizing the villains in your life are not just villains, that they do have their reason for doing what they do. And they have a worldview, right? Psychological. They have values and reasons for doing what they do. Let's see, what other questions do we have? Somebody really liked the audio book of Marina M. and asks if the same person is going to do the audio for Chimes of Lost Cathedral. This woman, Elena Schmulenson, who got an audio award for the reading of Marina M. And I believe she is also doing Chimes of Lost Cathedral. She said it was like living in a long play. Yeah, I had a long drive up here to Sacramento and listened to T.C. Boyle's short story collection, the Relive Box, and all these short stories. I just love listening to good literature. I'm the opposite of many people who listen to crap in the car but read great stuff on the page. I do not want, when you're listening to a book on tape, it's coming right into your head. I do not want anything but the best language entering my ears. So I often pick up classics on audio from my library, things that I missed. And the library is good because there's a lot of serendipity going on. You get what they have. And I have read such wonderful books that I probably wouldn't have taken the time to read if I hadn't been able to listen to them in the car, because I live in LA and I drive a lot and I take road trips and stuff, and I just love, I'll sit there in the garage to finish a chapter, not want to turn it off. So here's a question. Do you plot your narrative beforehand or adjust the initial idea as the story progresses? I do not plot my narrative. Although the short story, I keep thinking about where it's going. But I don't plot beforehand because for me, there's a question that comes up, that this is what is going to happen to this. And the voyage of discovery is what I do it for. So if I knew what was going to happen, I probably wouldn't write it. But I usually have an idea at the beginning. I know where it's going to start. I know the character and the situation. We talked about the XYZ story structure. I'll start with a character and a situation that will put pressure on that character. And then as it goes along, sometimes I have ideas of where I think it might go, but I quickly jettison them when I see where it's actually going. I had a writer friend named Les Plesko, wonderful writer, No Stopping Train, Last Bongo Sunset. You ought to read him. And he always told his students, just don't have ideas. And it's impossible to write without having ideas, but I think what he meant was just be prepared to jettison them as soon as something else is happening that's more interesting, go with that. Do you have to understand your character off the bat, or do you explore and change as the story continues? Anna asks. Oh, absolutely. I adjust the character a lot. Josie Tyrell changed a great deal in Painted Black. I started her as much more fragile, much more vulnerable. And what would happen is that my antagonist was so strong that if she was that vulnerable, she just would have been crushed and there would have been no story. So I needed to strengthen her to be strong enough to push back when pushed. So you do start with a rough idea of a character, and then you do change it as time goes on. And sometimes you don't see your character for years with a novel. You don't, because they're your camera. So you see things as they see them, but it takes a while to turn the camera around and see the character. And you're asking yourself questions. Even when White Oleander, when they were making that movie, the director asked me, so how do her teachers see Astrid in a classroom? And I'm like, the book has already been written, it's out, and they're making a movie. And I was like, I had no idea, I had to think about it. I imagined her probably not talking a lot in class, that the teachers would look at her as a kid who, quiet, bit of a loner, dressed, pretty shabbily, and yet always knows the answer if called on. But it takes a while. It took years to turn it around and see that character. Do I write poetry? I talk a lot about reading poetry and reading the work aloud and having that music. Do you write poetry? Have you ever thought, I can't see the rest of it. Have you ever thought of publishing a book of poems? Oh my God. I have started to write, my characters write poetry. I have started to write poetry as a gift to myself after publishing the first volume, after publishing The Revolution of Marina M. There is a week at Squaw Valley where I teach in the summer in the fiction program. There is a poetry week that I've always been super tempted to do. And as a gift to myself, I took that and took that week as a participant, and it was so amazing. And I learned that what is a poem? I don't write poetry. I really write narrative that's broken into lines, and my own poetry kind of gallops on. And so I actually am learning how to write poetry, but not anything that anybody would want to see. So I'd rather have my characters write poetry than they can do it, because I don't do that very well. But my characters can. It is really weird. My relationship with my characters is very odd, because they can do things that I can't do. They are people that have traits and abilities that I don't have. And they can write poetry, they can make art, they can, Marina is so different from me. She's brave in a way that I am not, and that no one I've ever written is like that. She's brave and she's confident. And unlike Ingrid, who was also brave and confident, she's a lover. She meets life with open arms. And that's been part of the fun, is writing someone who is so different, and to kind of come to understand how she lives in the world. There must be a piece of me somewhere that is like that. So there's food for thought. Let's see, maybe one, I'll get one more question here. Here's one, Christie's question. Handling flashbacks and interior monologue for backstory versus integrating backstory into character communication in the present day about past event. Pros and cons of that. Okay, so how do you handle information in backstory? I am a great believer in working backstory into present scenes. So because you can go anywhere in the psychological and move back into the present and then back into the past, I really like using backstory. Say a person is sitting at the kitchen table writing their bills or something, and something reminds them of something that happened in the past, like one of the bills maybe from the vacation reminds her, that restaurant reminds her of a fight she had with her husband at that restaurant. And then in the mind, she can go back and pick up a bit of the fight, the scene, the fight, then come back to the present, that scene of come back to the dining room table where she's doing her bills, maybe answer her phone, maybe somebody comes through the room, her husband, do you want another cup of coffee? She can be back in the present and then go back again. And so it's a scene in the present, but you use it and you lay the flashback in there. I think that's a really elegant way of handling it. The other thing you can do is do an entire chapter, past, present, past, present, past, present, if it's that kind of a story. But I like using the present and then going back just for a burst of what it was and then coming back to the present. I think that's a very elegant way of telling a story. And I think we've answered pretty much all the questions, unless anybody has a last minute. So this is the idea of thinking in poetry. I think that's true. Character Ingrid thinks in poetry, and Astrid does too, because she's been around Ingrid. Marina's a poet and thinks in terms of poetry, and a poet will use like little bits of poetry that they know that perfectly describe what they're seeing, in a way that a sports person, an athlete, might remember something a coach said or something they saw on the track or something like that. So thank you very much for joining us for a Writing Wednesday, and we'll see you next week. And if you would like to see what my tour is for Chimes of Lost Cathedral, it's up on my website now under events. And if you would like to pre-order Chimes of Lost Cathedral, that would help me a great deal. All right, so take it easy. Bye.